So our first speaker today will be David Oshinsky, and he's going to be giving us a talk on the history of medicine. So I'll turn you over to him.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I made a nice long trip, and it's definitely been worth it so far. So thank you for bringing me here. What I would like to do today is to kind of give you a brief survey of infectious disease in medicine. And I do mean a brief survey, excuse me, because I have to cover quite a bit of territory. One of the things you probably know, maybe from your own college experience, is that history of medicine is not taught a whole lot in our high schools or in our colleges. We tend to focus on political history, economic history, gendered history, history of race, all of which are extremely important. But history of medicine has been given short shrift. And I think what COVID-19 has done is to kind of have a reevaluation about the importance of the history of medicine. And what I would say, certainly in terms of infectious disease, it is remarkably important in determining the way our country evolved. And I'm going to give you numerous examples, and we'll obviously get to COVID. But let me start off by talking about, I will get the first slide up. There we go. This is a slide of Cortez in Mexico. And what we learned, this is in the 1500s, obviously, and what we learned about this in high school and college and the like is that 1,000 soldiers took over an empire of many millions. How did they do this? If you look at the rendering there, what you see is Cortez is on a horse. He has... Oh, I cannot... I am so sorry. We'll get to George. I promise, we will get to George. Oh, yeah, I'm supposed to see that, I guess. Could have been worse. There we go. Thank you. You want me to hit the next one just to see? Yeah, that works. And that works. So we will come back. So when you see Cortez here, he's in shining armor. He's on a horse. He's got muskets. He has technology on his side. There's a kind of inevitability to the conquest. But the more historians have looked at this, the more they've seen that there were all kinds of factions within the Aztec Empire. Cortez was very good at sort of turning one against another. But by far the most important element in that takeover was disease. Now, we talk about what is called the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange means what the old world gave to the new world and what the new world gave back to the old world. And you get in terms of, say, foodstuffs. The new world gave the old world, meaning Europe, maize, tomatoes, potatoes. Indeed, so much so that you probably could not have had the Industrial Revolution in England without those foodstuffs, which really increased the population dramatically. What we gave, what the old world gave to the new world were citrus, apples, onions, coffee, etc. But in disease, the Columbian Exchange was extraordinary. I'll say one other thing. The Cortez and the conquistadors brought horses to the New World. They had not been there. And that became extraordinarily important to native populations in terms of hunting and their geography and the like. But when you talk about what really transpired, it was disease. The Old World, Cortez, Columbus, and others brought smallpox, measles, chickenpox, influenza to people who were kind of in an ecological bubble. They had never been exposed to any of these diseases, and they died in enormous numbers. The best estimates we have is that after Cortez and then going into the next century, probably 80 to 90% of the indigenous Mexican population was wiped out by disease. And the same thing occurs again, and particularly smallpox. The same thing happens again when the colonists come to the New World and begin to settle along the eastern seaboard. They didn't bring diseases with them, on purpose. They just they were part of the baggage that colonists brought along. But in doing so, the evidence seems to point to about 90% of the indigenous population along the East Coast being wiped out by disease, which obviously made colonization a lot easier. We do have a handful of instances where colonial militia talked about bioterrorism, in other words, using smallpox blankets and handing them over to the Indians. There are two cases. The biggest case is a man named Jeffrey Amherst, who was one of the leading generals in the French and Indian War, after whom Amherst College and Amherst, Massachusetts are named. And there are letters from Amherst in which he actually does talk about giving infected blankets to the native population. Whether that actually happened, we do not know. I'm sure many of you do not know because I live on the East Coast. It's more of a story. But there were big protests at Amherst College. Some people actually there, some particularly students, wanted to rename the college, which wasn't going to happen. But what they did was did away with their team name. Like Texas's the Longhorns, they used to be the Lord Jeffs, and they now have a different name for their football team and basketball team and the like. But it gives you a sense of how incredibly important disease was in kind of changing the ecology of the New World to the advantage of the colonists, even though it was not done purposely, and clearly to the disadvantage of the indigenous population. All right, here's General Washington, and this is a painting of Washington at Valley Forge. It was a brutal winter, and Washington's men were camped outside of Philadelphia, and the British were in Philadelphia proper, and they had food, they had wine, they had fire, they had everything they needed to survive the winter. Washington, both at Morristown in New Jersey and at Valley Forge in 1777, Washington was surrounded by intensely cold weather, soldiers who were undersupplied, and disease. Now, Washington knew about smallpox. I'm not sure if you know about it, but Washington actually had smallpox as a younger man. He got it in the Bahamas when he took a trip with his brother. Washington, if you look at paintings, actually, they're kind of done over. Well, you can see pockmarks on his face. He survived. And as some of you may know, smallpox is gone now. If you survive smallpox, you will be immune for the rest of your life. It doesn't come back again. But the mortality rate at that time was about 30%. So what Washington decided to do, in really a remarkably courageous manner, was to what you call variolation of his troops. Washington did it because his men were in bad shape and smallpox was surrounding him, but also in 1775, Washington had sent a part of the Continental Army to take over Quebec. And that attack did not succeed largely because there was so much smallpox in the ranks. I mean, is there a possibility Quebec now would be part of the United States? We'd be playing a lot more hockey? Possible. It's possible. But basically, the assault itself, led by Benedict Arnold, who some of you may be familiar with the name, did not succeed. So Washington was very aware of the implications of smallpox on the battlefield. And he had to make a decision. The British were 30 miles away in Philadelphia. His troops were now being racked by smallpox. What do you do? And what Washington decided upon was a method pre-Jenner, pre-vaccination, called variolation, which some of you may be familiar with, in which you take a stick and rub it into the pustules of an active smallpox person, an active case. And then you take that stick and you stick it into the arm of an innocent person, in other words, someone who does not have smallpox. That person who has been variolated will now get a relatively minor case of smallpox if he or she is fortunate. The mortality rate for variolation was about 2 to 3%. The mortality rate, as I said, for smallpox was about 30%. What Washington had to make certain of was that the British did not find out about this, because if they did, they would have attacked. I mean, most of his army was on its back. And what Washington did was to quarantine the men who had been variolated, and those who took care of them were other soldiers who had had smallpox earlier and could not get it again. They were kind of the nursing staff. And come spring, the variolation was successful. Most of the soldiers survived. Washington now had a fighting force that could go on. And there was never a major smallpox outbreak again in Washington's Continental Army. Would the Revolutionary War have turned out differently? Who knows? You know, it's a counterfactual question. We'd obviously be the nation we are today, regardless. But it may have certainly lengthened the war. And the British certainly, I think, would have done better in the second half had Washington lost most of his Continental Army. Okay. This is a cartoon from the early 19th century in England. As many of you know, in 1796, a British doctor named Edward Jenner developed a real smallpox vaccine. And this was a vaccine that did not inject or variolate. It did not put live smallpox into the person's arm. It put cowpox, which was a sort of a similar virus that obviously would protect against smallpox. How did Jenner know this? There were a lot of milkmaids in his area, and these milkmaids all had fair skin, but marks all over their hands where they had been milking the cows. And this happened generation after generation. And Jenner, simply by observation, believed that there was obviously something in the cowpox virus that prevented smallpox. He didn't know from viruses, bacterium. He didn't have a microscope where he could see this. He just had an intuition. And what Jenner did, I think we'd have a lot of trouble doing it today, is he took a young boy, a 9-year-old boy, in his town, and he vaccinated the kid with cowpox. And then what he did was to wait, and the kid came down with a very small case of cowpox, a fever, some rashes, and the like. And then about 10 days later, Jenner injected smallpox, live smallpox, into the child. We probably don't do that today. This is a human challenge trial gone wild. But the child did not get smallpox. And Jenner tried it again and then again. And every time he had the same result. There was a reaction to the cowpox virus, but no one got smallpox. And Jenner then developed a vaccine using the lymph from cowpox. And that vaccine was really the first major vaccine that we have in the world. And it was, it had problems. It hadn't been purified. There was tetanus bacillus in it. There were all kinds of bacterium. But in the case of smallpox, it worked very, very well. What the cartoon there is really the first anti-vaccine movement. And what do you see in this cartoon? You do see Jenner kind of standing up there in a brown coat, but he is surrounded by people who are turning into cows. They're growing udders, tails, horns, and the like. The anti-vaccine movement at that time, which grew in England very carefully, was, had various elements. One of the elements was from the church. Thundering from the pulpit were ministers who said Jenner was doing away with God's work. God determined who lived and died and how long that person should live, and Jenner should not interfere. You also had people like Thomas Malthus, whom you might recall as the great economist and I would say early sociologist. And Malthus had a theory that population was based on the amount of food in society. And if the population grew too great, there was going to be disastrous competition for a limited amount of food. So for people like Malthus, smallpox was good because it culled the herd naturally. In other words, people died out in large numbers, and therefore you didn't have to worry about the food supply. And finally, you get people like this, who say, I'm not putting anything foreign in my body because I don't know the consequences. And the consequences in this rendering here are that you're going to turn into a cow. And this sort of, you get the kind of all the pillars of the anti-vaccine movement: religious objections, personal freedom, and the notion of whether vaccine is good for society as a whole. I'm going to fast forward now very, very quickly. By the 1890s, and this is in the United States, there was a major movement to vaccinate people. And I'm not sure, very few people know the difference between compulsory vaccination and mandatory vaccination. People tend to conflate the two. There is a minor difference. Compulsory vaccination has been used very rarely in the United States. Compulsory vaccination means we are going to line you up and vaccinate you whether you like it or not. And the last time I know of that occurred was that there was a devastating measles outbreak in Philadelphia in the 1990s, in which lots of kids were dying of measles. And it turned out that the epicenter was a religious sect that did not believe in vaccination. And their kids were getting, you know how infectious measles is. Their kids were getting measles at an enormous rate, and a number of them died. They had, I think, at least 10 deaths in this one sect. And a judge gave the okay to take these kids away from their parents and to vaccinate them. So that is really compulsory vaccination. It's very rare. What we have today in the United States is mandatory vaccination. And I'll get to that later, just a little bit more. But what mandatory vaccination means is you do not have to be vaccinated, but if you don't, you're going to pay a penalty. That penalty can be you're going to lose your job, which is now out with the Biden mandates. And I flew on United Airlines yesterday, and they have given a terminal date for people who refuse to be vaccinated. They're giving out medical and religious exemptions, but they're doing it very, very carefully. And they'll probably be firing over 1,000 people. That's a relatively large number. So with mandatory vaccination, that penalty can be you don't have to vaccinate your kids, but you can send them to school. you got to homeschool them. In other words, it's the penalty involved. And I'll talk in just a bit about the Supreme Court case that brings this about. By the 1890s, various cities and states were taking a much tougher line toward vaccination. And here is a sort of half photograph, half rendering of police in Milwaukee dragging children out of high smallpox areas, either children with smallpox or children who've likely been exposed to smallpox, and moving them into hospitals. And you can see that riots took place because parents were not about to give up their children. And this became a rather common scene in the United States during this period. I assume you've all heard of Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary was an Irish immigrant cook, single, who came to the United States and took a job cooking for the wealthiest families in New York City. It turned out that Typhoid Mary was a carrier of typhoid fever. And what makes her interesting in a medical sense is that she is the first silent carrier to be identified. And by that I mean that she showed none of the symptoms of typhoid fever, yet the typhoid bacillus was filled in her body, and she was giving it to other people as a silent carrier. Well, to make a long story short, with a good sense of epidemiology, the city figured out what the common person was in terms of spreading this disease, and it was families that the Typhoid Mary had cooked for. She was caught. She was brought up before a judge, and the judge told her that they would let her go, but she must never cook again for other people. She said fine, but no one trained her to do anything else. And 5 years later, under an assumed name, she began cooking again. And one of the places where she was cooking was a hospital where people in New York City, where people were dying in large numbers from typhoid fever. So, Mary is again caught, and this time she is sent to North Brother Island in the East River of New York City in quarantine and spends the rest of her life there. She spends more than 3 decades and dies on North Brother Island. She never comes back to society. And what is happening in this era, this is right in what you call a progressive era, between about 1890 and World War I, where individual states were going out of their way to protect, quote, the helpless, workers, children. They were doing away in various states with child labor. They were passing maximum hours and minimum wage laws and the like. Typhoid Mary kind of was caught in this new progressive sense. Now, this progressive sense could go too far. Progressives turned out in many ways to be anti-immigrant because they thought immigrants were diluting the bloodline. I don't know how many are familiar with eugenics, but a number of progressives, important progressives, including Margaret Sanger, were involved in eugenics, which was basically finding out people they believed should not be having children and sterilizing them as a way of protecting the race as it went forward, the human race as it went forward. So there was a positive and a negative aspect to the progressive era. This is Jacobson versus Massachusetts, and I would just urge you basically to think of this as the most important Supreme Court case involving public health in our history. And it involved a minister in Cambridge, Massachusetts, named Henning Jacobson. There was a breakout of smallpox in a number of cities in Massachusetts, excuse me, and the Massachusetts legislature allowed the cities to pass ordinances regarding smallpox vaccination. In Cambridge, the ordinance was perfect mandatory vaccination, meaning either you take this vaccine or you pay a $5 fine. $5 fine was a lot of money in those days. So you either had to do one or the other. Henning Jacobson was a minister. He didn't believe in putting anything foreign in his body. He hadn't got a sign from God that he should be vaccinated. And he just said, I'm not getting vaccinated and I'm not paying the fine. So the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in an extraordinary influential ruling, Justice John Marshall Harlan, who was one of the progressives on the court, John Marshall Harlan was the only negative vote in Plessy versus Ferguson, that legally segregated the races. And he writes, the Constitution of the United States does not import an absolute right in each person to be at all times and in all circumstances wholly free from restraint. There are manifold restraints to which every person is necessarily subject for the common good. It's a wonderful statement. It really means that we as communities are engaged in what you call a social compact, that we agree to forfeit some of our rights so that we can protect the weakest among us. And that really became the law of the land for a good portion of time. All right, I'm going to fast forward. This is New York City in 1947. The reason I show this, there are a couple reasons. I have a personal reason. I don't think I was in that line, but I got my smallpox shot as a very young boy during this epidemic, really the last smallpox epidemic in New York City. And let me just give you the details because they're interesting. A tourist gets off a bus at the Port Authority in New York City. He had been to Mexico. And when he gets off the bus, he's feeling feverish, but he goes to the movies, he gets a hotel room, he goes out to eat, and then within a short period of time, he begins to show the telltale symptoms of smallpox. So he goes to Bellevue Hospital, where I now happen to work, and at Bellevue, he is worked upon and then sent to an infectious disease hospital, but one of the workers at Bellevue's dies of smallpox, and there are other cases. There are about a dozen cases. What the mayor of New York City asks in 1947, as does the public health commissioner, is to ask every New Yorker to voluntarily get a smallpox shot. And for those who have already had a smallpox shot previous to 5 years ago, get another one. There was no penalty involved, but in a period of 5.5 weeks, close to 6 million New Yorkers lined up and got a smallpox shot, which gives you a sense that the anti-vaccine movement was not very powerful at this time, but public health was. We would look, well, there is no more smallpox today. Quite obviously, it has been wiped off the face of the earth. As you know, it's the only infectious human disease to be wiped off the face of the earth. And the irony is that it is also the greatest killer in human history. Hundreds of millions of people died from smallpox. Smallpox turned out to be easier to eradicate than other diseases. One of the reasons is it has no animal hosts, as, say, COVID does. Once you get it, you're immune for life. And smallpox has no silent carriers, meaning when you get that disease, you show it immediately. And therefore, what the World Health Organization and other groups did in the 1970s was have this massive eradication campaign for smallpox, but it was much easier. What they would do would be to look for areas where there was clear smallpox transition, and they would quarantine those areas, and they would use containment and surveillance, which meant they didn't have to vaccinate every person in the world. And just by doing that, that sort of limited ring vaccination, they did away with smallpox. You can't do that with COVID. Obviously, there are too many silent carriers, and there are animal hosts. So we're going to have to find, obviously, different strategies for doing this. Okay, I'll talk more about this at lunch, but I just wanted to kind of get this in. This is the great polio crusade of the post-World War II era. There is Albert Sabin with his oral polio vaccine given in a dropper on the tongue, and you see him giving it to a little girl on the top. And there on the bottom is Jonas Salk, about 8 years before, giving his inactivated, killed virus injected polio vaccine. What I would want to say about this, and I'll talk a lot more about it at lunch, it's always a fascinating situation when several million parents line up their kids for a disease and a vaccine in which no one is certain whether it works, how safe it is, et cetera. It gives you a sense of sort of risk versus reward, how frightening polio was in that era. What I do want to say very, very briefly is that this was the high point of science in American society. This was an era in which respect for physicians was at an absolute all-time high, including among my parents and their feeling toward my pediatrician, who could have, I'm giving a ridiculous example, could have said, you know, David will be a healthier kid if you push him out the window. My mother would have asked which window. There was just, it was very one-sided, and you know, it was a different era. It was so different that I'll tell you folks, I think, will be interested in this, that in the late 1950s and early 60s, as penicillin is rolled out, streptomycin, polio vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella, et cetera, infectious disease journals and medical school professors are urging students not to go into infectious disease. It's over. We've taken care of it. And you realize kind of the arrogance of that with coming down the line, you know, Legionnaire's disease, Zika, Ebola, HIV/AIDS, SARS, MERS, COVID-19. You know, nature is always one step ahead. But there was that extraordinary moment in the 1960s where the belief was that infectious disease was on the run and very close to being eradicated. It's quite extraordinary. Okay, I'm going to take you back a little bit to 1918. And that is, the great influenza is probably more comparisons are being made to that particular disease vis-a-vis COVID than any others. It was devastating. It came in a number of waves. The first wave came in the spring of 1918, and if you got it, you were largely immune to the variants that came in the fall of 19 and were extraordinarily dangerous, and they were the killers. This was a disease in which generally we talk about when influenza, the young get it and the old get it, they are most at risk. The influenza of 1918, the group most likely to get it and to die from it were people ages 20 to 40. It's really sort of an outlier. And there have been many theories about why. Well, it was in the middle of World War I, and soldiers were being recruited, and they were living in very close quarters, and they were in trenches where they would run down and this and that, all of which is probably true. but we have also looked at civilians of that age who did not go into the Army, and women who did not go into the Army. And the 20 to 40 age group is by far the most prevalent. I don't have time to go into the various reasons, but what most medical and public health people have focused upon is cytokine storm. In other words, that when these people saw an invader that they had never seen before, their immune systems reacted in an extraordinarily powerful way. And what it did was to create this battle in the lungs where you had lots of mucus and flotsam and dead cells. And what we do know about the 1918 epidemic is that more people died of bacterial pneumonia by a mile than died of the influenza. So it's very tricky, and we're still working on it. But I think those are what I would call sort of the latest information that we have. The one other thing I would talk about, and let's see if we have another one here. Yeah, this would be just another Spanish influenza. Don't spit. There's a lot of spitting in the 1920s. There was no vaccine. They tried to have vaccines, but there was no workable vaccine in 1918. So they had to go to other measures. And those measures were mask wearing, social distancing, canceling big events like bond rallies and parades, staggering work hours so that not everyone was on the subway at the same time. And a major study was done, and I would recommend it to you, about 10 years ago in JAMA by a physician named Howard Markel, M-A-R-K-E-L. And what Dr. Markel showed, he had a large number of people working with him. They took about 45 American cities, and they looked at the mortality rates of disease, of 1918 influenza disease in those cities. And what they found was that the cities that put in place the strictest restrictions, cities that kept them going the longest period of time, and cities that enforced them carefully had significantly lower mortality rates than those who did not. And what tends to lead to is the notion that indeed social distancing, mask wearing, and the like worked. That it's as a non-pharmaceutical event, these things really did play an important role in keeping the number of deaths down. Okay, I wanted to show you this. I thought it might be of interest to you. It's very hard to talk about infectious disease without talking about HIV/AIDS. These are handwritten, the first surveillance figures of HIV/AIDS in New York City in the early 1980s. There were only at this time about 153 cases for men and 6 cases for women. KS is Kaposi sarcoma. PP is pneumocystis pneumonia. And what they were finding even early on were that there were these opportunistic infections that seemed to be running rampant through the gay community. And no one knew why until it was figured out that HIV/AIDS itself attacks the immune system. And where I worked, I didn't work at the time at Bellevue. Bellevue had more AIDS patients than any hospital in the United States. And more patients died of AIDS in Bellevue than any hospital in the United States. And what is remarkable is that there is sort of a heroic timeline to this. And it was extraordinary how well these patients were treated. But there was a period of at least a year and a half in which They did one survey of residents, and 45% of the residents thought it was their choice whether or not to treat an AIDS patient. You had people resigning. You had cafeteria workers refusing to touch the utensils of people with AIDS, so they went to plastic plates and plastic utensils. You had workers refusing to clean up the vomit and the refuse, and you had to find people who were willing to work with masks and galoshes and do just that, and they did. You had, and I'm sure some of you are old enough to remember this, the great fear among physicians at Bellevue was a needle stick in which you were taking blood and you accidentally stuck yourself. And about 1 in 250 cases did come down with HIV/AIDS. It took a while, but Bellevue basically was re-educated in what it meant to be a physician and what it meant to treat all people regardless of the diseases they had. And there was no vaccine. There still is no vaccine for HIV. But like we may be seeing today with COVID-19, there could be pills. Merck and AstraZeneca are now coming out with antivirals that may be able to deal with COVID early on. That's what we found so far, early on. And that is somehow similar to what happened with AIDS itself. Let me finally finish very briefly talking about COVID. What are the I'll give you the two things that I found most extraordinary about what has happened in the past year and a half. And by all means, I encourage you to put your own 2 cents in. The first is sort of the miracle, the absolute miracle of these vaccines. Normally, it takes about 8 to 10 years to have a vaccine fully accepted by the FDA. It has to go through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, animal trials, and then all kinds of FDA panels before it comes out. It costs over $1 billion to test a vaccine and to get it ready, which is an awful lot of money. And fewer than 10% of the vaccines that start out actually wind up in the market. The other thing, excuse me, is that vaccines up until now have never been great money makers for big pharma. Everyone thinks they are, but in fact, they until very recently, a very small percentage of pharma revenue came from vaccines. Why? You know, I mean, I take Lipitor every day. I don't take a vaccine every day. They use much more sparingly, right? Research and development is extremely expensive, and the failure rate is very high. And vaccines traditionally have been a litigation magnet. The federal government does have vaccine courts now, but you can go to civil court. And therefore, there are lots of cases involving vaccine injury. And what a number of vaccine makers decided was that it just wasn't worth it to keep producing them in the United States, and the numbers went down dramatically. Many of the vaccines that we have today are produced outside of the United States. Then suddenly we have Operation Warp Speed. Probably not the greatest name, but better than the first name. Secretary Azar wanted to call it MP2 after the Manhattan Project. So I could understand the Manhattan Project was amazing, and the atomic bombs did probably end World War II, I believe. But on the other hand, they also incinerated 2 cities largely of civilians, and it's probably not the portrait that you want to have for a life-saving vaccine. Operation Warp Speed also was a problem, I thought, from the very beginning, because what it seemed to do was to prioritize speed over safety, which was not at all the case. But many people just saw this coming out so quickly that they just said, I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait to see what happens. Operation Warp Speed turned out to be the greatest public-private partnership in modern American history. As many of you know, the big companies, Moderna was not. Moderna was more of a startup, but it had a lot of money behind it. But the other big companies all were told by the federal government that everything was going to be paid for. There was no risk on their part. Research and development will pay for all of it. Manufacturing will pay for all of it. Indeed, we are going to do something absolutely unprecedented. We're going to allow you to manufacture the vaccine while you are developing it. Now, no vaccine company would ever do this, because if the vaccine failed in development and you had spent billions on manufacturing, you'd have to throw all of that vaccine out. Federal government said, don't worry about it. We just want to conflate the time span, so we will, if the vaccine fails, you don't lose a nickel. The only thing you won't gain is that we won't put it on the market. We won't buy it. But your R&D and your manufacturing and every imaginable supply that you need will be given to us. Only one company said no, and that was Pfizer. Pfizer said, we don't want to get involved with the government. We don't want to get involved with bureaucracy. We haven't done this before. We are going to develop our own vaccine. We're going to manufacture our own vaccine. And if it works, then the government will buy X billion vials of lots of this vaccine. Now, it seemed very noble for Pfizer. On the other hand, Pfizer is the biggest company, the biggest of big pharma. The $4 billion it would have gotten from Operation Warp Speed was a drop in the bucket. And what happened with Pfizer is that they then could sign contracts with the federal government in which all intellectual property rights went to them, because they were the ones who did it and the government had no part in it. And in which there would be no march-in rights, meaning that if the vaccine was failing or they were charging outrageous prices for it, the government could not step in and take over the process. So Pfizer got a really, really good contract from the government, and given its size and the amount of money it makes, it was not a big deal for them to be the outlier in this case. So what happens? We get these vaccines in record time. We find out there are mRNA platforms ready to go that can produce cheaper vaccines, better vaccines, stronger vaccines, safer vaccines. It's just incredible. In the old days, you had a situation where the drug companies basically had to grow the virus, purify the virus, and everything had to be done in a laboratory. It took forever. And then they finally moved into manufacturing, where it might or might not work. With mRNA, you basically send signals that train the cells of the body to produce what has to be produced. And what it produces is sort of, the crown of the coronavirus, a spike of that crown, and that alerts the immune system to the fact that there is an invader. There is no actual virus in that vaccine. The body itself becomes the factory. So we are on the cusp of amazing new stuff. The other thing that I must admit that went along with Operation Warp Speed was the surprise of many people at the vaccine hesitancy and outright vaccine rejection that occurred. If you would have asked an infectious disease person 10 years ago, when the anti-vaccine movement was just starting up and really beginning to solidify, if you would have said, we are going to have a deadly pandemic that's going to kill 725,000 people what do you think is going to happen to the anti-vaccine movement? And the answer was, everyone I talked to, it's going to die out. Who's not going to want to get a shot? And yet that hasn't happened. And maybe, I'm not going to go into it at any length, but a number of you can come up and give your own opinions as to, particularly since you're seeing real patients, as to what is going on. But my sense is, and I am truly depressed by this, is that the social compact in Jacobson that lasted for 115 years, that social compact has clearly broken apart. There used to be a sense, I think, in this country that one of the reasons we took vaccines was to protect ourselves, but another reason we took vaccines was to protect those who could not be vaccinated and were at great risk. I think that compact has broken down, and I am skeptical of our ability to put it back together in the future. I hate to end my talk on a down note. I do everything I can to go around the country talking up vaccines, trying to figure out ways to enable people to want to take it, and we will see the outcome. I honestly do not know the figures in this area regarding what percentage of the population has been vaccinated and what percentage of the population says that this will never happen to them. You can educate me on that. But I would love to go back to the era of Jacobson, the era of my smallpox shot, the era of the Salk and Sabin vaccines, and have America come together again in united fashion. And God willing, I'm wrong, and that will happen. Thank you very much. And thank you for that. Anyone who has a question, I am told you can, or not only a question, a statement.
A statement.
Yeah. Can,
I want to chide you gently on mandatory and compulsory.
Okay.
I think your chronology is wrong. When I was drafted in 1964, I was lined up and given vaccinations with the option of going to Fort Leavenworth Prison.
Okay. You are correct. This largely relates to civilians, and that is the reason I gave George Washington as an example. It is different in the military. But in a way, you still have that dichotomy in the military. You don't have to be vaccinated. You can leave. You may get a dishonorable discharge. I don't know what the consequences are. I do know now that every someone in the military, in every branch of the military, who shows reluctance to be vaccinated will be talked to by people who are expert at listening and trying to convince them. But the Army is indeed a special case, and thank you for your service. Any other?
Yes, sir.
Sorry. Yes, sir.
Yeah, after 30 years in the military, I can agree. I'd like to start with an up note, if I may. You know, I grew up in a town where there was a large statue of Jenner. And as kids, we would parade by this statue, and our mums would tell us how good Jenner was. So we had respect for vaccination from a very early age. I don't think that statue's been taken down yet. You had an interesting cartoon early on. I loved that one about smallpox, where the cows were growing out of people's heads and bodies as yes, those anti-vax are everywhere. What I thought was interesting and wasn't mentioned was to the left of the picture, it looked like they were trying to feed cowpox to the people. Of course, Jenna never intended that. Yes. Just, out of a large bowl. And it reminded me of the early days of COVID when it suggested we should all be drinking detergent, remember? I come to my question, which is, you gave an interesting story of smallpox coming from Mexico into the United States, and I'm curious about your attitude to the border management at the moment.
I'm sorry, say that again?
I'm curious about the present management of people coming across the border from Mexico into the United States.
At this very moment.
At this time,
Yeah,
thank you.
As best I can tell, many people coming across the border, they do not have information or validation of the fact that they have been vaccinated. So I don't know, but my gut feeling is it probably is an issue at the border. Someone may know this better than I. I know that certainly on the conservative media, among the conservative media, that has become a very big issue about allowing unvaccinated people, or not checking as unvaccinated people, coming across the border. What is interesting to me is I taught 12 years at the University of Texas, which I loved, and I loved Austin. But it is remarkable to me that the people in South Texas who are complaining about lack of vaccination, that is one of the lowest vaccination rates in the country for American citizens.
Question for
yes, there are a couple of it. I'm sorry.
Question about masks. So I remember in the early days of COVID that even Dr. Fauci said that masks are not important. And then trying to come to that and figure out what was right and I was trying to look up Cochrane reviews and other things, and you were saying about the 1918 flu and how it was helpful. Why do you think it took so long for people to realize that masks do work? But then there's also evidently a couple of studies showing that cloth masks don't. It's only surgical. And talk about that.
That's a very good question. I start off by saying that I'm not sure most Americans read JAMA. I could be wrong. I would say that one of the biggest problems, and you've really raised an important issue, one of the biggest problems involving COVID is that people like Dr. Fauci have been to some degree all over the map. And one of the reasons is that the data just keep coming out. So in other words, you can say something, and then a week later, there'll be a major CDC study that shows that what you've said may have been accurate at that time, given the very small amount of data, but things have changed. And I think that really has played into the anti-vax philosophy. In other words, these people don't know what they're talking about. They change their mind that at every particular moment there's no consistency in it. And as a doctor and a scientist, that you have to go with the data, and that new data may be very different than data a week ago, especially when you're going at breakneck speed like we are now. I mean, there have been endless mask studies that have come out in the past few months that show that masks, in fact, do work. But there probably are outliers, 2 or 3, that say the opposite, and those are the ones that the anti-vax movement hits upon. So I think what we're dealing with is we are experiencing COVID in real time. We don't have the luxury of waiting 30, 50, or in the case of 1918, over 100 years and finding out exactly what the most responsible data were. Okay, I think that's the best way I can answer your question, but it's a good question.
Okay.
Yes?
It's a multi-level question. Okay, compared to the Spanish flu and the current pandemic, what's the number of deaths? Because 720,000 people seems. I mean, that's amazing that we're not getting 100% vaccination. Okay, that's one. Number two is, what could we have done different to not have this controversy surrounding this COVID pandemic? And what can we do in the future, in 100 years from now, when they have their next pandemic, that this won't happen again?
I'm not sure I have time
Yeah.
to answer all of that. Let me certainly give you the statistic, which is important. By best estimates, about 700,000 people died in the pandemic of 1918. We have already exceeded that number. We're up to about, excuse me, about 730,000. The difference, which most people tend to ignore, is that in 1918, we were a nation of 100 million people. Today, we're a nation of 330 million people. So those numbers really do not hold up well because we're more than 3 times larger today. So clearly 1918 had a more dramatic impact. And the other impact is in the world. As best we could tell, between 50 and 80 million people died globally in the 1918 pandemic. It is the most people to die in a short period of time, in a year's time, than at any time on record. 10 times more people died of the 1918 influenza than died of bullet wounds on the battlefields of World War I, and also civilian deaths in World War I near the battlefield. So in that sense, it really is, it's hard. I'd say what we're undergoing now is the closest thing to 1918, but the numbers are still, there's still a wide variance in the numbers. What was the other part of the question before? What are we going to do about it? I'm sorry, I missed that.
The other part of it is, why is it so controversial? I mean, I don't understand why that is. I mean, we're a nation, we want to protect each other. You know, we've always been a nation where, you know, we do for others before ourselves, but yet that's not the feeling right now. And then the other part was, what can we do in the future to, you know, reel it in faster? I mean, this is going on 2 years now. My goodness. How long did the Spanish flu last? You know, before it was under control.
About a year.
And then the origin, too, that's a controversial thing. I know you don't have time, but 2 cents worth on that, on your part.
Okay, I'll just go to the first part of your question. I think in the era between 1965, 1970, and today, a number of things happened that dramatically increased the nation's suspicion of elites. I think the Vietnam War, when people realized the government was lying to them, you add in Watergate, that would be one part. I think you have a sense that big pharma is just this behemoth, and all it cares about is making money by turning out products that may or may not be safe. That has occurred, I think, largely through the internet. The internet is wonderful, but what the internet tells you is be your own expert. Don't listen to what other people say. You collect your own information and you decide for yourself. And if you go on the internet and you look at, say, the National Vaccine Information Center, which is the largest anti-vax on the web, it has bells and whistles, and it's incredibly professional looking. They also have had a number of researchers like Andrew Wakefield who came out with a flawed, fraudulent study in England saying there was a correlation between autism and the MMR vaccine. And it was published in The Lancet, for God's sakes, and as horrible as that study was, as flawed, it took The Lancet more than a decade to retract it. And I know of Andrew Wakefield because I lived in Austin, Texas, and he's there now. Wakefield lost his medical license in England, came to the United States, was not given a medical license, went down to Austin, where he is into holistic medicine in the worst imaginable way, and basically is a vaccine skeptic who has not changed his view. And the more he is attacked by the medical establishment, the more his supporters rally around him, given the idea that he is standing for truth and they are standing up for themselves and their own profits, et cetera, et cetera. And we have had that enormous divide. I think that what has broken down as well in America, when I talk about the social compact, is that more and more Americans are saying, I have the freedom to choose what vaccines and what medicines go into my body. And there is a sense that it ends with me. It doesn't go beyond. And that is what I think we are going to have to change. And I was just curious if there's anyone in the audience here. We all know that probably the best person to deal with vaccine-hesitant parents, not absolute anti-vaxxers, but vaccine-hesitant parents, is the pediatrician. And pediatricians are in this awful mess now where they have to really decide for themselves. Do I space out vaccines? I know this is not the right thing to do, but this is what the parents want, and I may lose the child completely. Or, and this has been happening in New York City, do I treat a child whose parents don't allow that child to be vaccinated? Do I allow that child in my office? And that is really about as difficult as it gets. Because in New York City, you can hand out a paper saying, I don't want to treat you because it's dangerous to the other children coming into this office. On the other hand, and they'll say, here are the names of 4 or 5 others in the neighborhood who will treat your child. On the other hand, if you live in rural Utah, there may be one pediatrician for 75 miles. And what do you do in a case like that? So if you're going to build trust, I think that, and you don't want to force mandates, and I believe that by this point mandates do have to be forced. I support them. The pediatrician is the person with his or her finger in the dike. And if any of you have any comments, I'd love to hear them. Yeah. Come to the microphone.
I agree with remarkable insight. I agree with everything you said, especially about attitudes and stuff. The other thing that I noticed in 40 years trying to talk people into vaccines is a lot of these people are looking at it in a faith-based way. And you can't change their mind, no matter how much science you give them. The head of the Mormon church has told them all to get vaccinated, and still there's a lot of hesitancy. I think our state's like 32nd, something like that.
The gentleman there was first, I'm pretty sure.
I think we're going to have to wrap up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Maybe, I'm giving a polio lunch lecture. Maybe we can set aside some time to talk about that there. Thank you very much.